Hi y'all, Raidwald here. This is going to be a video response to Stephan Molyneux' video entitled Proofs for God Destroyed by a Philosophical Atheist. Since his video is fairly long, my video may actually be broken up into multiple parts to make it a little more digestible for you. And I'm going to take the liberty of cutting as much of his fluff out as possible. For those of you who know Stephan, he is verbose and has the gift of gab. So I'm going to try to carve some of that out and just maintain his arguments, which I can then respond to. My purpose in making this video is simply to refute the arguments put forth by Stephan Molyneux, not to establish the existence of God. That can be handled in a different video, a future video. It is simply to establish that Stephan's arguments that God does not exist, and his refutations of what he terms to be proofs for God, were insufficient. So let's go ahead and get started.
We'll start with a definition that God is an eternal and immaterial consciousness.
Not in all religions, not even in all Christian religions. In fact, Mormons believe that God has a tangible body, as material as yours or mine.
All-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect, and if we're going to have a look at proofs of God, we're going to have to ask, what is a proof itself? Proof is defined as a combination of logical consistency and empirical evidence.
Okay, that is an absolutely horrible definition of the word proof. And first of all, a combination of empirical evidence and logical consistency isn't necessarily proof of anything, right? You can offer up empirical evidence with logical consistency on both sides of an argument, and both sides may be insufficiently proven. You see this all the time in court cases. Second off, there are plenty of things that may be proven without appealing to empirical evidence. For example, René Descartes' famous dictum, "I think, therefore I am." This is a proof of his own existence based on the fact that he thinks. In fact, I'm going to offer you a challenge here. Can you prove your own existence as soundly as did René Descartes, using only empirical evidence and logical consistency, a combination of the two? What empirical evidence, in other words, can you appeal to prove your own existence? There's any number of other proofs that can be arrived at, very legitimately, without appealing to empirical evidence. And one thing that you will have difficulty arriving at is, for example, a proof that empirical evidence is necessary, while appealing to empirical evidence, right? If we're going to get into some epistemological questions, how would you go about proving empirical evidence is a necessary cause for proof while actually appealing to empirical evidence? There is no empirical evidence of such. You must, in other words, rely on logic and reason only in order to make your case for empirical evidence. Third, we're supposedly discussing philosophy here, right? You're a philosophical channel, and yet there is no mention or discussion of what a logical proof is. Logical proofs are actually very similar in a lot of ways to mathematical proofs. It's where you start with an equation of some sort. In this case, you're going to have one or more premises on one side and a conclusion on the other side. And you need to get from the premises on the one side, following preset rules, and step by step demonstrate how to get to the conclusion. In order to accomplish this, you've translated the linguistic argument into a symbolic argument, and it actually will end up looking quite mathematical for anybody who's not familiar with how logical proofs are done. And here's your example of what it would look like. It must also be remembered here that a logical proof only demonstrates that an argument is valid. In the realm of logic, a valid argument is an argument in which, if all the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. This does not necessarily mean that the conclusion is true. An argument may be valid and one of the premises may be false, in which case the conclusion will not necessarily be true. A logical proof can only demonstrate that an argument is either valid or invalid. It doesn't demonstrate that an argument is sound, which is to say that the premises are true and it's valid. In other words, a sound argument is one in which the conclusion by necessity is true. So, in order to demonstrate that God exists, we're probably better off going with a more legalistic definition of the term proof, for which I'm going to appeal to the Oxford Dictionary online. Just looked up the word proof. It says evidence or argument establishing or helping to establish a fact or the truth of a statement. This is a much better definition of the word proof. It's not one I had to make up myself because I'm not trying to be one-sided in my argument here. So I'm going to proceed in addressing your video based on this definition of proof rather than yours.
This is the basic scientific method. Logic is the necessary but not sufficient requirement. You need to have logic. Your theories need to be logically consistent, but it doesn't mean just because they're logically consistent they're necessarily true.
Empirical evidence doesn't mean your argument is necessarily true. Neither does a combination of logical consistency and empirical evidence. I can make a logically consistent argument with some empirical evidence to back it up that is actually false. And I can in fact point to the entire history of science. Pretty much the entire history of science has been a history of one faulty proposition supplanting another. Now each successive proposition becomes closer to what is true. That's the great strength of science, right? But ultimately you look at the scientific theories of the 19th century and how they were supplanted, each one supplanted by new theories, and each of our theories today will be supplanted by theories in the future. All of them ultimately untrue, and yet all of them also logically consistent and supported by empirical evidence. For example, I'll offer here an anecdote that was shared to me by an acquaintance of mine. He was at home reading a book with the light turned on, and the light went out. He believed that the light went out because the bulb burned out. So he replaced the bulb and turned the light back on, and lo and behold, the light came on. This was taken as proof of his initial hypothesis that he had a burned out light bulb, because he tested the hypothesis by trying a new light bulb, and the new light bulb worked. Therefore, the initial light bulb must have been bad. Later, when his wife came home, he talked to his wife about it and found out that the power had gone out for a few moments in their neighborhood. Therefore, his rather scientifically approached conclusion, while not necessarily false, must be called into question, and he could test his new hypothesis by digging the old light bulb out of the trash and retrying it.
In any conflict between human logic and empirical evidence always wins.
Except in such cases that it doesn't. Not to put too fine a point on it, empirical evidence, the human senses can be fooled, can be tricked. There are hallucinations and the like, and sometimes a person must appeal to their logic rather than their empirical evidence for truth.
The first requirement is logical consistency. So your theories have to be logical, as mentioned above. If logical consistency is not present, the theory fails. You don't need to go any further into empirical testing.
Hold on. You just got through telling us that in a conflict between logic and empirical evidence, evidence wins. Therefore, I'm left to assume that if there's a logical inconsistency, then you are duty-bound to continue to look forward to see if there's any empirical evidence. Wait, did I just find a logical inconsistency in your argument?
These two criteria are required because theories, logical theories, statements of truth about the objective universe, they describe things which exist in reality. And reality is both rational and material. That's why you need logic and evidence. This is the difference between me saying...
The interesting thing about your little proof here, that both logic and empirical evidence are necessary for a proof, there's no empirical evidence for it. That's rather a glaring fault, if you ask me.
The theological thesis. God exists. That, of course, is the basis of religion. So the first question the philosopher will ask is, okay, well, God exists, but compared to what? When we say God exists, you got to have what's called a null comparison, or a standard against which the statement can be measured. So we have to say, well, God exists, and we're going to measure that relative to God not existing. There have to be those two conditions, otherwise it's a nonsense statement. It doesn't mean anything. If I say, Nag de Fubar, then clearly there's no null comparison because the statement is incomprehensible. What would I compare it to? Not Nag de Fubar? It wouldn't make any sense. So we have to have a comparator in order to say that something exists. We have to compare it.
Actually, in the realm of logic, Nag de Fubar and not Nag de Fubar make perfect sense. As much sense as P and not P.
To non-existence. So, continuing on with our definitions, when we talk about existence, we are talking about an objective material presence, matter and or energy, or objectively measurable effects of that material presence, such as gravity. A complete absence of matter and or energy or any associated effects is the definition of non-existence.
It would be the definition of non-material existence or material in existence. But for example, the number 2. The number 2 has no material existence. So it has a non-material existence. It is a concept. It does nevertheless exist as a concept.
So when people say God exists, they are making a factual claim about the objective existence of an entity, which must be composed of matter and or energy or their measurable effects. So let's have a look and see if we can't dig him up. God and the material. Now, God must exist in some detectable form for the statement God exists to have some meaning. Because when people say God exists, they don't mean God exists as an idea within my mind.
I'd be very willing to bet that some people, in fact, do mean exactly that. I'm not one of those, but in order for you to prove that there is no God, you must disprove all gods and all conceptions of God. So it's on you to be more inclusive in your definitions and in your approach than I have to be in my belief.
But rather, God exists objectively as an entity outside our minds in reality. But of course, if God exists outside our mind, and existence is that which is composed of matter, energy, or its effects, God must be detectable in order to qualify as existing in some objective manner. God and logic. If a self-contradictory statement is proposed, a square circle exists, then material evidence is irrelevant.
Is this what you meant when you said that empirical evidence trumps logic?
And I'm just going to use matter here, but because I don't want to keep saying matter, energy, and effects. The laws of logic are derived from the sensual behavior of matter, as we perceive through the senses.
I take issue with this statement as well. Humans are indeed sensual beasts, but we're also conceptual beasts. We spend our entire lives building mental models of the world we live in. Conceptual models that are ever increasing in their complexity. Our laws of logic are based on very, very abstract concepts which often have no bearing whatsoever to what we can actually observe in the outside world. For example, the very basic concept of a negation. What is not P, or like you brought up earlier, not defugbare? Now you said it was nonsensical, but in logic it's not. It is a negation. It is a negation of nabdefubar. And you don't even have to know what nagdefubar is in order to understand that there is a negation of it. So for P, or nagdefubar, whichever you prefer, let's go ahead and instantiate fish. Not fish. Have you ever seen a not fish? Now, I'm not talking about something that is not a fish. I'm talking about something that is the negation of a fish. Have you ever seen that? Then how do we have logical laws written around the negation of a fish if it's not something that you can see? It's not something you can sense. If the laws of logic are, as you claim, based on what we can sense of the material world, then why is there a concept for the negation of something that we can see in the physical world?
Thus, where matter is involved, logic is required.
That is a horribly invalid argument. It'd be much more true to say that since logic is derived from matter, anytime logic is involved, matter is required. But it simply does not follow that if the laws of logic are in fact derived from matter, then wherever matter is involved, logic is required. It simply does not follow. For example, the laws of mathematics, arithmetic, are based on logic. Thus, wherever math is involved, logic is involved. However, it does not follow that wherever logic is involved, math is involved. It simply does not work that way.
So when somebody says a square circle exists, we do not need to hunt all over the universe to prove that a square circle does not exist. It is not an ambiguous statement. A square circle is a contradiction in terms. It is something that is itself and something else at the same time, which is like saying a rock is a rock and a seagull simultaneously, completely impossible. And so it's an invalid statement.
Remember that in the world of logic, valid refers to an argument in which the conclusion follows from the premises, not necessarily a true or sound argument. So it's very possible to create an argument in which the conclusion is that a rock is also a seagull at the same time. It could be valid, but not sound. So let's use these terms correctly.
You don't need to go any further in terms of disproving it. It's not a we'll agree to disagree thing. It's just incorrect. In any conflict between human logic and empirical evidence always wins. So when somebody says a square circle exists, we do not need to hunt all over the universe to prove that a square circle does not exist. A square circle is a contradiction in terms, and so it's an invalid statement. You don't need to go any further. In any conflict between human logic and empirical evidence always wins.
I see.
Self-contradiction and proof. A self-contradictory statement disproves itself. If I base some 10,000-page mathematical theorem on the assumption that 2 plus 2 equals 5, no one has to go beyond the first page of my proof once that error is detected.
I'm just going to point out here that an error is not necessarily a self-contradiction. What you've provided in your example for self-contradiction is an error. 2 plus 2 does not equal 5, but that's not necessarily a self-contradictory statement. A better example of a self-contradictory statement would be to say that, for example, that in any conflict between logic and empirical evidence always wins, and that if an argument is logically inconsistent, then no empirical evidence can overcome that fault.
If my first premise is incorrect, everything that follows is incorrect, by definition.
Well then, why am I bothering with a point-by-point refutation? In 2015, the President of the United States of America is Abraham Lincoln. Therefore, Stephan Molyneux' argument is correct. I guess by definition, your argument is incorrect now, huh? See, this is what happens when you don't... Either you ignore the rules of logic, or you're ignorant of them. For a philosophy channel, or a channel that sells itself as a philosophy channel, you have failed to do your due diligence in one of two aspects. Either you do not know the laws of logic, and therefore cannot apply them to yourself, in which case you have failed in your due diligence in regards to yourself. Or you have mischaracterized those laws to your audience, in which case you have failed in your due diligence towards them.
So, logic and the kahuna. The first thing that we need to do is look at the logic of the proposition. We don't run to physical evidence or anything like that. We look at the logic, the internal consistency of the proposition. If the logic of the proposition is self-contradictory, the proposition falls of its own accord. In any conflict between human logic and empirical evidence always wins. If I've come up with some crazy-ass unified field theory that requires that an atom be both a carbon atom and a fish simultaneously, my theory fails, to say the least.
What I find hilarious about this is that fish are carbon-based life forms. There are tons and tons of carbon atoms, which are also parts of a fish. Now, I know that's not what you were going for, but I just thought that was actually kind of hilarious.
My sanity has failed as well, I think. So, God and immateriality. So God is defined as immaterial.
Except in those religions that believe in a corporeal God.
Which means no evidence of matter, energy, or its effects. In other words, an entity which can never, ever, ever, ever be detected in any rational or objective manner whatsoever is claimed to exist.
With the exception of those religions that have some claim that some person at some time saw God, or heard God, or touched God. After all, hearing, seeing, and touching are forms of detection.
However, existence is, by definition, the presence of some sort of objectively detectable matter, energy, or effect.
That would actually be the definition of material existence. There are, after all, things which exist immaterially.
Thus, by defining God as immaterial, the statement, God exists, is non-existence exists.
The statement would actually be, an immaterial being exists immaterially, or has a non-material existence. Which I'm sure those theists who believe in an immaterial God could agree with.
The complete absence of any detectable form.
Remember that using the qualifying term of detectable automatically discounts from your argument here any religion that has a claim at having detected God.
Matter, energy, or effect exists, but of course that is the very definition of non-existence. So here we have a square circle, a completely contradictory statement. And it fails. God, knowledge, and power. Here's another example. God is defined as all-knowing and all-powerful. So does God know exactly what he or you or I is going to do tomorrow? If God knows exactly what he is going to do tomorrow, then God is all-knowing. But then cannot be all-powerful, because he doesn't have the capacity to change what you or he or I are going to do tomorrow.
Unless, of course, he can know what he or you or I are going to do tomorrow, unless he acts, and then he would know what that effect would have. Right? Now, I can leave a room with the light turned off, and I can know that the light will remain turned off until I go in and turn the light back on, in which case the light will be turned on. I can be all-knowing about that situation, right? Lights don't turn on by themselves, and even if the electricity cuts out, the light will not turn on. So having left the room, assuming there's no other means to enter the room and nobody else in the room, Having left the room with the light turned off, the light will remain off until I go and turn it on. And then I am capable of understanding the fact that the light will be turned on. This does not change my power to turn on the light or my power to know the consequences of either not turning on the light or turning on the light. Now, granted, this is a fairly simple situation, but it's not impossible to conceive of a deity or a greater intelligence, a greater consciousness, who can conceive of all the causes and effects in the universe, and to be able to understand what effects his causes will have on the future. Another approach to this is A, not all religions would define God as omnipotent, omniscient, or both, right? There are gods who are neither omniscient, omniscient, or omnipotent, and there are gods that could conceivably just be omniscient, and gods that could just conceivably be omnipotent. Another failing you have here is that not everybody would define omniscient and omnipotent in the ways that you do, right? You might call a god omnipotent, who is able to rearrange matter that exists, but doesn't necessarily have the power to cause new matter to exist. I think, for all intents and purposes, omnipotent would be fitting for such a being. Yet, you could argue that he's not omnipotent because he is unable to bring new matter into being. Again, it's just a matter of how you want to define these terms, and you have to realize that if you're trying to speak against all gods, you have to address your arguments to all possible conceptions of God and all possible definitions of the terms that are being applied to this God, or any God.
If God has the capacity to change what he is going to do tomorrow, then he can be all-powerful because he could do anything he wants, include change his behavior tomorrow, but he cannot be all-knowing.
Unless all-knowing is defined either as including the ability to understand the effects of all that you do, or defined as not being able to understand the effects of all you do. In either case, both terms could be applied to an omnipotent God. Alright, I'm going to cut it short there for tonight. Keep an eye out over the next couple of days for the rest of my response to Stephan. I'm probably going to get 3 or 4 videos out of this. But anyway, if you like the video, please rate it, leave all your comments below, and I will see you guys later.